every year sees another class inducted into that big hall of fame in the sky, taking their place in wrestling history as a contributor to this great business come art form. Older names who forged their legends in the territory days of the 70s, promoters who changed the industry behind the scenes, and tragically, younger stars who went far too soon. It's time to celebrate and remember the lives of all the wrestlers and wrestling personalities we lost in the year 2021. Butch Reed. Butch Reed, real name Bruce Reed, might have made his debut for the WWF at WrestleMania 3, but he had been wrestling for almost a decade before, wrestling for various territories, most famously in Mid-South Wrestling as the babyface tag partner of the Junkyard Dog. Reed took on many of the promotion's top stars, facing the likes of Jim Duggan, Magnum TA, and even wrestling a 1-hour draw with NWA champion Ric Flair. They got there first, Hangman Page and Bryan Danielson. Reed went to the WWF in 1986 as the natural Butch Reed, where he wasn't exactly a pushed star, but definitely a featured one, competing in the main event of the first Survivor Series. Perhaps Reed's most successful period came after WWE as he ventured to Jim Crockett Promotions, where he teamed with Ron Simmons and Teddy Long as Doom. Reed left WCW in 1992 and wrestled sporadically until his final match in 2013. Reed also made a cameo on a September 2000 episode of SmackDown because how could you not love Teddy Long? Rusty Brooks. Kurt Koski was better known to the wrestling world as Rusty Brooks. Trained by Jim Eisler and Dean Malenko's father, Boris Malenko, in 1982, Rusty Brooks signed on with WWE just 2 years into his career, and while he never reached further levels of stardom, he did have a number of highly promoted matches. He wrestled WWF champion Hulk Hogan in 1985, and later took on tag champions the US Express and the British Bulldogs. He worked as a heel jobber before eventually opening the Rusty Brooks Pro Wrestling Academy, where he trained big-name stars Conor O'Brien, Luna Vachon, MVP, Gangrel, Diamante, and Norman Smiley. An incredible track record. Josephus. Joseph Hudson, better known as Josephus and the Question Mark in the National Wrestling Alliance, passed away early this year. He was best known for his work in the NWA following the promotion's relaunch in 2017, having a major rivalry with then NWA champion Tim Storm and later forming a team with Aaron Stevens, aka Damien Sandow. Josephus was also known for his distinct look, earning him the role as Bruiser Brody's body double in the first season of Dark Side of the Ring. Jim Crockett Jr. Jim Crockett Jr. will have one of the most interesting legacies of a wrestling promoter. On one hand, he was the last territory to give Vince McMahon and WWE a run for their money, putting on arguably the best wrestling in America during the 80s. But on the other, his business choices ultimately led to the sale of Jim Crockett Promotions, the company that would ultimately become WCW. Crockett was a second-generation promoter, taking after his father, Jim Sr. What is it with wrestling promoters and naming their sons after themselves? Oh yeah, the industry's massive narcissism. Jim Jr. would be president of the NWA for 3 terms, which was a very significant title at the time. He eventually bought out several territories in the late 80s, including Championship Wrestling from Florida, which brought the future icon Sting to stardom. Crockett left wrestling after 1991, and despite a few short-lived attempts to return in the mid-90s, he left the business for good in 1995. Crockett was one of the most successful promoters of all time, giving us talent like Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, Ricky Steamboat, the Road Warriors, and so many more. Barry Orton. Most people probably know Randy Orton is the son of cowboy Bob Orton Jr., but not as many know that his uncle was also a wrestler. And even more shockingly, his real name was Randall Orton. Randall Barry Orton, or Barry O, wrestled from 1976 when he was trained by his father and brother. He had multiple stints in the WWF in the 80s and early 90s, while also wrestling in several territories across North America. Barry retired from wrestling in 1991, but later came back for one last match, a battle royal for Pro Wrestling Guerrilla of all promotions, which was won by Roddy Piper. In a 2005 interview with Slam, Barry said he never saw himself as a wrestler, instead wanting to be a musician growing up. He also dipped his toe in the acting pool in the 90s, appearing in a number of minor roles in movies and shows. New Jack. You will not find a more controversial wrestler on this list than Jerome Young, better known to the wrestling world as New Jack. The biggest outlaw in a generation of outlaws, New Jack debuted in the USWA in 1992 under his iconic ring name. After a few years bouncing around what was left of the 90s territory scene, New Jack and Mustafa Saeed began working for Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling, squaring off against the Rock and Roll Express. But New Jack is, of course, best known for his insane work in ECW. His proficiency for taking crazy bumps and inflicting insane amounts of punishment earned him a reputation that varies from positive to very negative depending on who you talk to. Whether it was the mass transit incident, the Vic Grimes scaffold match, beating Gypsy Joe, New Jack's controversies were plentiful, but he remains one of the pioneers of the hardcore wrestling style. Don Canoodle. Charles Donald Canoodle Jr. may have one of the best wrestling names ever, and he was also part of one of the most underrated tag teams in wrestling history alongside Sergeant Slaughter. A two-time national arm wrestling champion, Canoodle impressed Ole and Gene Anderson in 1973 by holding his own in a shoot wrestling match with amateur wrestling champion Bob Roop. Canoodle and Slaughter formed the Cobra Corps in Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, having an incredible steel cage match with Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood, another highly underrated team, in 1983. Canoodle went on to wrestle for the WWF sporadically throughout the early 80s, appearing for the NWA from 1984 to 1986 and wrestling the occasional indie match from 2002 to 2006. Melissa Coates. Melissa Coates was a Canadian bodybuilder who began training to wrestle under Killer Kowalski and the Ultimate Pro Wrestling School in the early 2000s. She was eventually signed by WWE to a developmental deal, being sent down to work with Ohio Valley Wrestling. Coates made a bizarre appearance at Backlash 2005, where she unsuccessfully took part in Chris Masters' Master Lock Challenge. Coates left WWE soon after, but would return to OVW even though she was no longer under a WWE contract. She also made a number of TV and film appearances during her life, including the first 2 seasons of Extreme Dodgeball, but she is likely best known in wrestling for serving as Sabu's manager from 2014. We actually interviewed Sabu and Melissa for Wrestle Talk years ago, and I will never forget the story how our poor camera guy had to find somewhere on her top to attach the radio mic to, while Sabu death stared him down. The Patriot, Del Wilkes. Del Wilkes, better known as the Patriot to Attitude Era fans, debuted for the AWA in 1988 after being trained by Greg Gagne. Originally using a cop gimmick called the Trooper, Wilkes stayed with the AWA until 1991. He had a series of stints in WWE in the 90s, the most high profile coming in 1997, where he even challenged Bret Hart for the WWE Championship. Wilkes was described as having no political friends in WWE at the time, as he wasn't part of Shawn Michaels' inner circle, and the Hart Foundation also weren't fans. It's a shame, as going by his work in All Japan Pro Wrestling, he could really go. His entrance music would later be reused in WWE for one Kurt Angle. Paul Orndorff. One of the most iconic names of the 80s left us this year as Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff passed away. Debuting in Mid-South in 1976, Orndorff feuded with a young Jerry Lawler, so you know he had a strong start. From there, Orndorff's career speaks for itself, working throughout the Southern Territories, having major feuds with the likes of Ted DiBiase, Dusty Rhodes and Junkyard Dog, before making his way to the WWF in 1983, where he was given the nickname Mr. Wonderful by Roddy Piper. Orndorff took part in the main event of the first WrestleMania and continued to work as a main event talent until his departure in 1988. He dealt with a badly injured arm as a result of a weightlifting accident though, an injury that would keep him from the ring for a good chunk of the 90s, and then suffered a terrifying neck injury during a match at WCW Full Brawl 2000, ending his wrestling career. Paul Orndorff continues to be celebrated as one of the 80s biggest stars, being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2005, the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame and NWA Hall of Fame in 2009. In 2017, Orndorff wrestled his final match in a 6-man tag at an indie show in Canada. Super Porky Brazo de Plata. Jose Luis Alvarado Neves was part of the Alvarado Lucha Libre family, wrestling in Mexico as Brazo de Plata, which translates as Silver Arm, but he's more known in popular culture by his WWE gimmick, Super Porky, a name he actually had before he joined the company, despite it being one of the most WWE names ever. Brazo's work in the world of Lucha Libre should not be undersold though, as he and his brother Brazo de Oro, which is Golden Arm, even crossed over into working for the NWA in Hollywood wrestling. Brazo de Plata's most famous match came in the culmination of a major rivalry between the Alvarado family and fellow Lucha Libre family Los Villanos, the Brazos lost and were forced to unmask in the biggest moment of their careers. Super Porky would sign with WWE in 2005 as part of the short-lived Juniors division on SmackDown. All of his appearances were comedy spots and never saw him step in the ring. Porky would continue to wrestle in Mexico until 2016. The Assassin, Jody Hamilton. Joseph Jody Hamilton is likely one of the lesser known names in this video, but he contributed substantially to the wrestling business. Brother of fellow wrestler Larry Hamilton, Jody began working in Kansas City in the 1950s. He was best known for his work as the Assassin #1 and then, later on, just the Assassin, wrestling all over the world and in many territories in the United States, and also working as a member of the WCW creative team. Jody was forced to retire due to a back injury in 1988, but it was later that he made his biggest contribution to the business. He opened the WCW power plant, which led to the creation of stars like Kevin Nash, Goldberg, Diamond Dallas Page, and Paul White. And he wasn't done there. In 2005, Jody and WWE relaunched Deep South Wrestling as a developmental territory where it lasted for 2 years. If he didn't do that, we wouldn't have that one weird match of Kenny Omega on the WWE network. Jody Hamilton's impact on the business continues to be felt today. When you made your debut in the 50s, that means you've done something right. Beautiful Bobby Eaton. What is there to say about beautiful Bobby Eaton? He is your favourite wrestler's favourite wrestler, or perhaps your favourite wrestler's favourite wrestler, depending on how old you are. He debuted in 1976 at the age of 17 as a last-minute replacement on the card in NWA Mid-America. Eaton would work the territories for a few years, honing his craft and becoming one of the smoothest and most polished wrestlers in the business by the time he formed the Midnight Express with Dennis Condroy and Jim Cornette. They, and later Stan Lane, are considered by many to be perhaps the best tag team of all time, and that is in no small part to Eaton's work. Their feud with the Rock and Roll Express is legendary, as well as their matches with the Fantastics. Eaton is definitely best known for his work in the team, but he is also considered one of the most underrated wrestlers of all time. He also has the reputation of one of the nicest people ever in the business. A much harder feat, but one that arguably means much more. Dominik Danucci. Dominik Danucci will likely be best remembered for who he introduced into the wrestling world later in his career, but that doesn't mean his career wasn't noteworthy as well. He made his debut in Montreal in 1958 before working throughout the Maritimes, Toronto and Winnipeg. He worked for Stampede Wrestling as well as the Australian WCW, where he wrestled greats like Killer Kowalski and Ray Stevens. Danucci actually continued wrestling into his 70s, wrestling Ivan Koloff in 2005 in a Russian chain match, but he'll also be remembered for being the man to train Mick Foley and Shane Douglas. Daphne. Shannon Claire Spurriel, better known to fans as Daphne, tragically died in September 2021. Daphne joined the wrestling business as anyone does, winning a contest put on by WCW in 1999. The company was looking for new talent and she was hired, making her name as the deranged girlfriend of David Flair. She even became co-WCW Cruiserweight Champion after a bit of complicated WCW nonsense in 2000. She went on to work extensively for TNA Wrestling in the mid-2000s, impersonating Sarah Palin with the Beautiful People before returning to her gimmick as Daphne. She and TNA did not have an amicable split though, as a bad injury cut her run in the company short, who let her go while she was still claiming workers' compensation, an issue that would be settled out of court over 2 years later. She made sporadic appearances on the indies before her passing on September 1st, a reminder to everyone who is struggling, asking for help is always possible, and remember to support each other. There are links to resources in the video description below. Ryan Sakoda. Ryan Sakoda debuted in his native Japan in 1998 and was able to work with top stars such as Masato Tanaka and Shinjiro Otani as part of the faction Team Emblem. His big break came in 2003 when he appeared for WWE during Triple H and Scott Steiner's Pose Down. What an honor! He was signed by WWE later that year and immediately made his debut on SmackDown, beating Jamie Noble and Rey Mysterio, which is much better. He was released the following year, however, but continued working as an indie wrestler until his passing. Angelo Mosca. Angelo Mosca was a big-time pro wrestler, but he was an even bigger Canadian Football League player, winning an incredible 5 Grey Cup championships and being inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. In wrestling, he debuted in Montreal after being brought in by the promoter Eddie Quinn in 1960. He had a main event career, working as the top heel of the WWF in 1981 and challenging Bob Backlund for the WWF Championship. Mosca continued to work as a promoter and commentator in Canada after leaving WWE, and Tempest would like to let you know that this man is a legend there, and he raises his glass of Molson to him tonight. Blackjack Lanza. The world's meanest wrestler debuted in 1961, being trained by Vern Gagne and wrestled across the United States for over 2 decades. He and Blackjack Mulligan were a top tag team formed in 1971 with Bobby Heenan as their manager. Their best work came in the WWF, where they won the tag team championships, and they teamed off and on until 1985 when Lanza retired from the ring. The Blackjacks were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2006 and the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2016. Jimmy Rave. James Michael Guffey was better known to the world as wrestler Jimmy Rave, a star of the independent wrestling scene of the 2000s. Debuting in 1999 under the name Mr. XTC, he soon adopted the name Jimmy Rave and wrestled for many of the top promotions in the world at one point or another. He was best known for his work in Ring of Honor during the promotion's early years. Wrestling as such a hated heel, the crowds threw toilet paper at him rather than streamers. I first saw him in TNA, where he tagged with Lance Hoyt, aka Lance Archer, as the Rock and Rave Infection, using Guitar Hero controllers as their gimmicks. Yay! The noughties! Rave would continue to wrestle on the independent scene until he was tragically forced to retire in November 2020. An infection resulted in his left arm being amputated, which was followed by an MRSA infection in his legs, which also had to be amputated. While this is absolutely not the end that anyone would have wanted for Rave's story, we hope that this look at what we lost in 2021 can be a celebration of what each of these wrestlers did in their lives, sacrificing so much just to entertain us all. Let us know your favourite memories of those we lost in the comments down below. I've been Ollie Davis.